Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening or good morning, depending, of course, on where you're from or where you're based. My name is George Heritage. I work in the Assessment Services Department in the Madrid office for Cambridge Assessment English. And this...
Hello, my name is Victoria and I work with George in the Assessment Services Department in the Madrid office.
If this is your first webinar, right, so Victoria, what are we doing? What are we talking about?
We are going to be talking about reading and use of English at C1 and C2. We are going to start by looking at abilities at these levels. And we will try to give you some ideas to develop your students' skills and to give, hopefully, practical ideas also to use in class.
Yes, and this is going to be slightly different. If you've been to our previous ones on individual exams, it's going to be different. We're going to be focusing a bit more on that jump up to C2 in reading and use of English. Okay, we won't be looking at every part of the exam and talking you through it as we have done in previous sessions. We want to think about what really makes C2 in terms of reading and use of English. Also, another little warning, the use of English we will look at very quickly and give you some exam technique tips. We're not going to sit here and teach you how to teach C2 grammar because we do not have time. And also, we'd like to feel that at this level, I think use of English isn't really something that you explicitly teach at this level. I think students aiming for their proficiency should already have quite an intimate and enthusiastic relationship with English, and their use of English almost, what did I say this morning, Victoria? Osmosis.
Yeah.
Through a lot of reading, a lot of listening, a lot of engaging with the language itself. But three things that are going to run through this and through our other sessions on writing, speaking, and listening. Victoria?
Yeah, the importance of skills integration. We think that it is always useful because it is how we use language naturally. But at these levels, we think that it becomes even more important because it allows for richer discussions, learning becomes more natural and authentic. We can also make use of material more effectively. And I think that it gives students the opportunity to have a more active role. I think that at these levels, teachers become more like facilitators. We are there to guide, but students have a more active role.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Salvador. Osmosis is the noun, but I'm wondering what the verb is. I think it would be osmosis. Somebody can confirm that later on. So looking at the CEFR, looking at the can-do statements for these levels and the differences between them, we're looking at overall reading comprehension. C1, Victoria?
Yeah, at C1, we understand that students can understand in detail lengthy and complex texts, I don't know what's that. Okay. Whether or not they relate to his or her own area of specialty, and provided that they can reread difficult sections.
C2 is quite a step up. Okay, so a wide range of long, complex texts, appreciating subtle distinctions of style and implicit as well as explicit meaning. Understand and interpret critically virtually all forms of the written language, including abstract, structurally complex, highly colloquial literary and non-literary writings.
Yeah.
And quickly, David, not our David, but David in the chat box, we're not saying it does not require preparation. I'm saying that it's not going to be the focus of today because I don't know how useful using webinar time to go through grammar really is. Okay. Just to clarify. And then looking by topic area.
Yeah, again, general ability at C1, students can read quickly enough to cope with an academic course. And at C1, we're going to see that they can understand documents, correspondence. C2, sorry.
Concentrate, Victoria.
Sorry. And reports, including the finer points of complex texts.
Social and tourist, this comes from the CEFR document, which is all divided into different domains. Just to give you a few examples. Social and tourist, C1, complex opinions or arguments expressed in serious newspapers. I'm not sure exactly what that means, and we'll look at that in more detail later. C2, Victoria?
Yeah, they can understand complex texts such as a tenancy agreement in detail, including its main implications.
Lovely. And perhaps more relevant for our purposes, work at C1, the general meaning of more complex articles without serious misunderstanding, which does allow for some misunderstanding, even at C1. C2, reports and articles likely to be encountered, including complex ideas expressed in complex language. And study, Victoria?
Yeah, they can scan text for relevant information and grasp a main topic of text. And at C2,
this is the worst.
Yeah, they can access all sources of information quickly and reliably.
All sorts of information in the target language, quickly and reliably. So yes, I mean, a lot of the time I think, people think, they've got their C1, C2 isn't that far, but we'd like to reiterate that the CEFR ladder, so to speak, I think is much better to visualize as an upside down pyramid, where each level requires exponentially more from the student, I think, rather than a sort of linear ladder. So, bearing this in mind, tasks at C1 and C2, Victoria, what do they need to ensure?
They need to ensure that that students can engage with a range of texts, as we've seen, of different lengths and complexity, also that come from different sources and are of different text types. Also from a task perspective, George?
I'm engaging with a range of different task types and question focuses, and again, a wide range of reading and language skills focuses. We have 8 parts currently in the C1 Advanced Reading Use of English, 7 parts in C2, and by no means are we saying that these are the only task types that are useful for measuring language abilities at this level. There are a huge variety of other task types. This is based on a lot of thought goes into the design of all of our exams in terms of does it test everything that we want it to test? Practicality. I don't know how many of you know, but in 1913 we had our first exam, which was proficiency. It took nearly 13 hours, I think, Victoria?
Yeah, I think so.
We had 3 or 4 candidates and they all failed. So now, I mean, C2 proficiency, it's nothing to be taken lightly. It's still, 5.5 hours, I imagine, with breaks, and obviously the speaking is done separately. But it's as, a realistic way of proving that you have this level. And just to warm all of you up, going on what we've looked at, for C1 and C2, skilled readers and users of language at this level, what can they do? Ideas in the chat box, please. What should readers at these levels be able to do? Yes, Salvador, 1913. That was proficiency. Then we released what became first in 1939. And then we stopped for a while. There seemed to be a world war happening after every exam. So, stopped for quite a while. Academic, yeah.
Scheme.
Lovely. Gist, reading, drawing inference, definitely. Understanding academic lessons in detail, skimming, scanning, implications. Analysis. Yes, excellent. We're going to break it down into 7, 8, 7, well done, I remembered. 7 points that we will carry on through what we look at in the rest of today's session. So you can look at those quickly. I don't think we need to read them for you. But the first four, a bit more sort of use of English focused. And the last three, I mean, all of these matter throughout. The first four are slightly more use of English focused, and 5, 6, 7 is more on what we would traditionally understand as reading. Okay. And we will also be using these 4 areas that we would like to focus on. We think these are all useful, equally important things to bear in mind when trying to help our students. So at the top, I think a big advantage, I mean a disadvantage and an advantage, we're aware that there's nowhere near as much material designed for testing this level as there is at lower levels. And unfortunately, that probably isn't going to change. But an advantage of C2 is that you can use almost exclusively authentic real-life texts, which means finding material is potentially easier for you. Next, Victoria.
Yeah, we are going to, as you said, work on language and language precision, because this is going to be part of everything we do as well. And we need to get students to use a variety of reading strategies. And the last point, George?
And yep, in terms of training and developing their skills, building up to an exam task, I think we should always remember to ask them for evidence and justification of their answers, of what they have come up with, rather than do the exercise, here are the answers. Okay. So let's get moving. Oh, quickly, what's this, Victoria?
Yeah, it's a resource. It's a website created by Cambridge University Press and us, Cambridge Assessment English, and there you can find lesson plans and also teacher tips. So you can submit your own tip if it works for you, so that everyone can benefit from each other.
There are fewer tips at C2.
Yeah.
Than the other levels, just because of the number of students and teachers, but they are useful. And if you have any useful tips, please go along and submit your own and call it. Okay. So starting off with a more detailed focus on language and language precision, looking at these 3 areas. So distinguishing between similar words, very similar words at this level, recognizing collocations, naturally, using them naturally and flexibly, and using contexts around gaps to decide on the correct answer. So is it a noun, is it a verb, is it a negative, is it a plural, are all things that these exercises we'll look at quickly focus on. So what is this, Victoria? This should be familiar to most of you.
Yeah, it is a part 1 of the proficiency exam. And it is a multiple choice task. Here we have removed the options because we are going to suggest an approach to do this. Right, George?
Yes. I think one important thing, especially at this level, if your students have taken B2 first, C1 advanced, they will have experience with this this task type. But my only real tip for this is, you do have these 4 options, but please encourage your students not to look at them before they even look at the options. Try and ask them to fill in the gaps themselves, okay? Because what do we call the incorrect answers, Victoria?
Distractors.
Yes, and at C2, the distractors are highly distracting and tempting. And the longer you look at what is potentially a wrong answer, the higher the chance of persuading yourself that it could be right. So I would always advise my students to try this first exercise without looking at the options, then look at them. Hopefully what they have come up with is one of the options there. This used to be, when reading and use of English were separate papers, this was in use of English. Now it is the part 1, but it actually counts towards our students' reading marks. Why is that, Victoria?
Because it has a more lexical focus.
Exactly. This is much more lexical rather than grammatical. So we're looking at collocation, maybe some, what was I going to say? Very similar to collocation, Victoria. Anyway, yeah, words that naturally fit together, and you cannot sit at C1, maybe at B2, you can sit and learn long lists of collocations, maybe at B2, but not at C2. No way. So the best way to practice for this is reading a lot, listening a lot, engaging with the language a lot. And our only tip, really, that we can thank you, David, exactly, and not even our David. The only tip I would give for this is, don't look at the options. The part 2 is an open close. Again, it's a gap fill with no options and with a very tight lexico-grammatical focus. So we're not going to offer you any advice on that. Sorry. Again, I think if students are ready for use of English at this level, my other advice to them was do not overthink anything. It should be instinctive, really. It should be your sort of gut feeling. If you're ready for the level, should be the correct answer. But using context around the gaps to decide on nouns, verbs, negatives, plurals, etc. Sorry, David Bradshaw is our colleague in the chat box, but there's another David who is also interacting in the chat box. Part 3, Victoria, how does this work?
Yeah, it is a text with gaps, and students need to come up with the correct form of the word. As you said, it can be prefixes, suffixes, negatives, nouns, verbs. So they need to decide. And I think you said this morning that the changes are not very obvious, so they need to think about it.
Yeah.
And the approach to this is to read the text at least 3 times. This doesn't mean that they need to take ages, okay? They just need to read very quickly the first time to get the general idea of the text.
Get a feel for the text, and then obviously reading in more detail around the gaps. Please make sure they check after the gap as well. Some of these is quite easy to come up with an option, but it's actually wrong because of what is after the gap. And always when they have finished, Victoria.
Yeah, they need to check that the text makes sense.
And Michelle, as we said, we don't mean read it in detail 3 times. We would say read it, you could read this in 20 seconds for a gist, then focus in on the detail, and then read it perhaps a little more slowly afterwards, just to make sure that it makes sense. Because it's such a shame when they get the right part of speech, but it needs a negative prefix or something like that for it to make sense. You know what I mean? Grammatically, they've done it right, but semantically, they haven't. And again, Alejandro, quickly, I mean, a quick skim, a skim read. And yeah, as Victoria said, this isn't the official Cambridge line, but for my C2 students, I would tell them that if it is far too easy, look at it again. At C2, these aren't easy transformations. Scarce, scarcity, spectacles, spectacularly. So make sure that they're aware of the level that is being asked of them. Okay. Moving on, Victoria.
Yeah.
Everyone's favorite or least favorite.
I liked it. I think it is a nice activity. It is part 4 of the reading and use of English paper. And there we're going to be looking at, of course, what comes before and after the gap, but also students, we need to recognize meaning and also be able to paraphrase the sentence that is given.
Exactly. So some nice ways to practice for this on the build up to then getting used to the task. This one, Victoria?
Yeah, in this case, what we are doing is we are giving students more words than they need, and they need to choose the ones that they need to rephrase and obviously put them in the correct order.
Exactly. Give them a couple of extras as well, just to distract them a little bit, make them really think. Another approach, give them some distractors. I mean, it does become harder at this level, again, to make the distractors sort of tempting. Here we have the key. B is a very nice distractor because it does make sense. but it doesn't have the same meaning as the original.
Hmm.
Again, there's not a huge amount we can really do beyond ongoing work on language and grammar and to help them here, but here are some nice ideas. Another teacher's tip, again, as we said, very little at C2, but some of them are relevant, like this one, Victoria.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I said the name of the website before. Some participants were asking about it. It's Practice Makes Perfect. Okay, maybe David can put the link in the chat. If not, it's in the handout for you. So in this case, what the tip is that students may want to cross out words that are the same or have the same meaning as in the given sentence, because this will help them identify the part that they really need to rephrase.
Lovely. Michelle, I will answer your question after this slide. So this, taking that tip up a level to C2, but yeah, identifying the equivalent parts of the sentence and the answer sentence should then shed light on the part of the sentence they need to transform that carries the meaning and the restructuring that will be necessary. This one isn't too tricky. We've flipped things around. So the carnival's success is under threat due to a lack of support. But making them aware of how the sentences have changed should then help them towards the middle. Michelle, it was removed from B1 in the revision because the testing focus was very narrow. We're very happy with the B1 revision, but it was only ever a few very specific language areas that were ever tested in that paraphrasing on the writing. Okay, so that's why it didn't make it through the revision. Okay. Right, so that's use of English out the way. God, thank God. On to reading, Victoria.
Yeah.
How are we going to start?
We're going to start by talking about what we do when we read, and in this case, when we read, we process different levels of information. At the lowest levels, we recognize letters and understand words, and at lower levels, the decoding part, it takes more effort. Then it becomes more automatic as we go to higher levels, and then we go on to understand the basic meaning of phrases, sentences. At B1, we start to work on implied meaning. That's reading between the lines. Obviously, this needs development in the coming levels. We also at B2 understand information across sentences or a paragraph. Then we move on to a whole text, and then at a higher level, C1 and above, we need to understand and combine information across texts.
Especially in that proficiency writing part 1, which we'll be looking at on Friday. This is another nice way to look at it in this, and we've chosen this pyramid because, again, as we saw in the previous one, it's clearer here perhaps, the skills are cumulative. So yeah, A2, very simple language that we're looking at, and it's careful reading for detailed meaning. That is it's still very relevant at C2, but it is a part of a bigger picture of other reading subskills. So B1, we introduce sort of faster reading and a bit of scanning. At B1, obviously with short texts, because it's only B1. B2 is a real sort of turning point, I think. Victoria?
Yeah, we are going to introduce other fast reading subskills, which are perhaps a bit more demanding, less skimming. And then we are also going to start asking our students to switch between careful and fast reading as appropriate in the same tasks. So they need to understand why they are reading to select the subskill that needs to be used. And then at C1 and beyond, we're going to be working on also the awareness of text structure. They should be naturally, so to speak, aware of text structure and where to find specific information or where it can appear.
Sort of like an automatic, you see a text and you have a fairly good idea in seconds of where you should be able to find information. If it is an essay, if it's an article.
Mm.
It's having that sort of built-in, oh, I know what kind of text this is. I should be looking for stuff here, here, and here, which you can only really do from a lot of exposure to a lot of different types of texts. Right, what are we moving on to now, Victoria? All types of reading, a little more detail on that. So as we said, careful reading, linear and slow. In a C2 context, probably happened after we've scanned, for example. So we locate where the information is and then very slow, well, not necessarily as slow as at A1,
but carefully.
slow, careful, detailed reading. And then faster reading, Victoria?
Yeah, skimming, scanning, and also search reading, trying to find specific topic in a part of the text.
And the difference between skimming and scanning?
Yeah, skimming is for the main idea of the text, and scanning is when we are looking for specific information, specific details.
I'd also like to talk about local and global reading. So careful local reading would be understanding a sentence. Careful global reading, getting the main idea of an overall text. And then fast local reading, scanning for specific bits of information. Fast global reading, skimming for the gist, general idea.
Main ideas.
Exactly. And yes, I love the graphic as well. I think Victoria did the one with the scan. Lovely. So some ideas to bear in mind, I think, whenever dealing with reading in class, building up to taking C2, for example, and in all other circumstances. Victoria, where do you want to start? Motivation or scaffolding?
Yeah, maybe we can start with motivation, which can be the starting point. We can ask our students to have a more active role. Maybe they can supply their own texts on different topics from different sources in different registers so that they can compare and contrast. Get them to interact fully with texts using pre-reading discussion questions or maybe follow-up activities. And also what we said about skills integration. It's vital to link reading with other skills such as writing, speaking. We are going to see that listening is also possible so that they can make a more effective use of the material.
Lovely. Text exploitation, even more so at this level. Any text that you use can be approached or... Oh, what's the opposite to approach, Victoria? Approached or moved away from in different ways. So pulling detailed structures and lexis out of text either before or after. Obviously, reflection activities and discussions. We'll look at some ways to take a text off the internet and create lots of different types of activities from it. And our favorite, scaffolding. That's yours, Victoria.
They're taking this step-by-step approach and giving students the opportunity to anticipate and predict what they are going to find with pre-reading, speaking, or vocabulary tasks. Also train our students to become more comfortable with reading faster and practicing different soft skills, and also creating opportunities for learners to read longer and more complex texts.
And getting used to dealing with those, because there are parts of the exam which are specifically designed to be boring, which we'll speak about later, but also the input texts are intentionally very long, because we do not want them to be reading everything in detail. That's not what we're testing. And they have to be equipped with the tools to make the decision in the moment to what kind of reading they're going to employ for that part. Right, so we're going to focus more on the traditionally, what we would think of traditionally as reading assessment part of the test now, and I think these three triangles are the most important that we'll be focusing on. So again, exposing to a variety of real-life text. How do we do that well and effectively? Again, the reading strategies, which we will not stop talking about because they're very important. And I think in a class situation, constantly asking them to justify their answers, justify their opinions, give evidence. And in doing that, we can bring some of the other colourful triangles into play as well. So we're going to start with a great resource. I don't know how many of you are using Write and Improve. I hope lots of you, because it's amazing. We'll look at it in a bit more detail on Friday. But we also now have Read and Improve, which is very much in development. It's not perfect yet, but I've been having quite a serious play with it, and it works wonderfully. So you log in using the same login as for Write and Improve. You choose your level, as you can see. You can search by topic if you want, or just choose a level and click, and it harvests real articles from the internet. Okay, it then gives them a level. From a reading point of view. So you can see here we had quite a variety. I chose this one yesterday, which was easier end of C2 on US consumer spending, blah, blah, blah. So you click through, you have the text there as it is. I've done a screenshot so you can't see all of it. So you have the article as it appears on the internet. You don't need to read, we're just talking you through it, okay? You can hover over any word. I went for durable on the penultimate line there. Click on durable, and what do we get, Victoria?
Yeah, we get dictionary definition, also information about the type of word, and examples of how to use it.
Very typical dictionary entry.
Yeah.
More interesting, well, I love dictionaries. Dictionaries are wonderful, but more interesting for our purposes, it gives you an estimation of what type of word it is. I've never seen it go wrong. As again, it's not perfect, but I've never seen it go wrong. It says in 97.21% of the cases where it has seen durable, it thinks it's an adjective. In this case, yes, it is an adjective. So the automated system believes it's probably an adjective. And what's really cool, I think definitely at lower levels, I say B2, C1, C2 as well, it gives you a word cloud, which is the most common words that it sees durable collocating with. Okay, it's a wonderful use of artificial intelligence, I think. It's a really nice way to use real life texts, and we're focusing on the language and language precision to a certain degree. And we can use this to practice reading strategies. One of the nicest ones is there is this little box at the end of each text, and it gives you a comprehension test. So how well do you understand the text? Read and write a short summary here. So yesterday I read it. I wrote this summary in about 5 minutes. It's not very long. Click the button on send, and it gives you a mark on relevance. So I got full marks on relevance. Thank God. C2 plus, and only halfway between C1 and C2 on my language, which I doubt. But it's a really cool tool. This link will be in the handouts that we give you. I'll give you access to the handouts now. As I said, all of the links we will be giving you in this handout. But it's a great way to practice for, especially the part one of the writing, great way to practice skim reading. You can time your students, give them a 500-word article, give them, 30 seconds to get a general idea, try doing a summary and then a more detailed summary. It's a really nice automated way for them to practice their reading and practice their writing. There's no timing involved on this, so if you trust your students, they can time themselves. It's a lovely, lovely resource, so please use it. It is still in development, but it's working wonderfully from the experience I have had with it. Okay. Right, moving on to the more traditional multiple choice and then the multiple matchings as well. A nice tip here, what we're talking about text exploitation. What's this, Victoria?
Yeah, it's just an idea to combine different types of tasks. So in this case, if you have a multiple choice task, you can choose the first 2 paragraphs and make it a word formation exercise. And then once they've finished, students can try even to write their own questions for each paragraph, and then compare them with the questions given in the initial task, if you want.
So exactly, you're getting 3 or 4 activities out of one text, or even start with a C2, especially start with a text that you find, perhaps on Read and Improve. Pull that out, you can turn it into word formation exercise, and then get your students to create the questions, and more interestingly at this level, the distractors.
Yeah.
You can also break it up and use use it for a more complex multiple matching task. This again from Practice Makes Perfect. So we're going to have a look at 2 activities for the remainder of the session. Again, how you can use real text and bring them to life and try and pull out a lot of these skills that we've been talking about. Okay. So firstly, oh, sorry. Oh,
Yeah,
I got ahead of myself. You have to stop me when that happens, Victoria.
No, it's okay. It's just another idea of how we can use texts, and it's just you know, when we have different when we have students we can get them in groups and get them to agree on, if we have a multiple choice task, we get them to agree on the correct answer. If the answer is incorrect, you don't give them the correct answer. You just ask them to think about it again.
And justify their answers
justify
again.
their answers again.
Exactly. Put the ball back in their court.
Yeah, and remove as much support as possible.
Yeah, we're at C2 now, so
Yeah.
scaffolding to a certain degree, but not too much. And again, as we keep talking about, trying to employ a variety of reading strategies. And working on the precision. So we'll look at this in more detail now.
Yeah.
Victoria, talk us through this.
Yeah, this task is based on the text from a magazine, online magazine. Okay, and what we've done is to start by integrating skills, because the topic Japan in Bloom maybe is not very familiar, at least for Spanish students learning English. So we decided to use a very short and easy video to get them to try to start thinking about the topic. So once they've watched the video, they can try and predict the content of the text and try to start using some of the vocabulary or anticipate some of the vocabulary that they are going to find. And this can be done speaking. Okay, so again, skills integration. Once this is more or less clear, we give them the first 2 paragraphs of the text, and we're going to get them to start thinking about the language and how language serves the purpose of in this case these 2 paragraphs to set the scene.
Exactly, we'll be looking at sort of style, syntax, something we call cohesive chains. Can you talk us through that, Victoria? In these 2 paragraphs, well, these 2 paragraphs, we have a lot of focus on color, bluish emerald, denim-y, warm greens, denim-y blue, or that might be later. A lot of nature vocabulary, trees, sky, cloud, etc. And giving them exposure to this in the first 2 paragraphs, they will see how that continues throughout the whole text. And these cohesive chains or sets sort of provide a unity to the text and add what Halliday and Hassan like to call texture to a text. David can send a link to a pretty serious publication on this if you're really interested. It's a few steps beyond what we would in earlier levels call activating schemata, etc., and trying to get them in the right mindset to predict what will come hereafter. So that's a really nice skills integrated
introduction.
Lead-in task. Sorry, Victoria, a little bit of a brain melt there. What is the next stage?
Yeah, in the next stage, what we've done is put the paragraphs in an order which is not the correct one. And here we have 2 options. You can get your students to work in groups and put the paragraphs in the correct order. So all the students have all the paragraphs. And another option, maybe a bit more challenging, is to give each student a paragraph. Get them to read their paragraph and say what it is about, so that they can agree on the right order.
They could also start looking in much more detail. We'll look at this in a second. If they're doing it individually, start underlining and highlighting clues which will help them reorder. Okay, so there are lots of different ways to approach this. You could, at B1, give them each a sentence. Give them a sentence as they move into as they come into the classroom, and then get them to reorder themselves as a class.
Yes, and these can be done face-to-face, of course. It works really well, but it can be done online as well. If you use Zoom, for example, you can have breakout rooms. If you don't use Zoom, you use another online platform, you can use Padlets and get students to work in groups in different Padlets.
And what we were saying about identifying the clues which will help them and give them some support if necessary, what do we go for, Victoria?
Yeah, in this case, we thought that time reference is a great tool here to identify the order of the texts.
Repetition and referencing, forward and backward internal referencing, so underlining commonalities, or the delivery truck, for example. It made me wonder, just as I was thinking this at the beginning of the paragraph, thinking what, referring back to the previous paragraph. It's very nice practice for the gapped, obviously for the gapped paragraph task in both advanced and proficiency, and for the multiple matching in advanced. And also synonyms and what we were talking about cohesive chains. You can get them to look for synonyms across paragraphs, or ask them to come up with 5 or 6 synonyms per paragraph, whatever they want. So we're always building that knowledge of and appreciation for vocabulary. Okay, the last activity.
There was a question about scaffolding for this activity in particular. I would say that if you get students to work together in groups, you are already giving them some more supports than if you give each student a paragraph. So just scaffolding, trying to give them more supports. Also with the time reference, if you are asking them to give examples of time references, you are guiding them towards.
Direct them towards the language they need to be looking for.
Exactly.
Look for examples of referencing. Look for examples of repetition. And it's up to you whether you can do an activity like this, 4 or 5 times in a month or 2, and give them less and less support as they go through.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last activity we look at hopefully integrates all of these as well as possible. We'll look at 2 versions of it. Okay. So the first version, this is appropriate, I would say, from B2 upwards, depending on the material you're using. So how does this work, Victoria?
Yeah, in this case, you need to find 3 new stories. Could cut the 3 texts up into paragraph chunks, place each story on a different table or in a different Padlet. Students need to work in groups or pairs, and each group is assigned a news desk and a story, or a news Padlet and a story. Then groups have to put the story back together in the correct order. And then as a follow-up activity, they can prepare a little summary for a radio clip. I think you had this idea, George, or in writing.
In integrating skills, because they could do a writing, what happened after the story, what happened before the story. They could record a little radio spot. It all depends, what your focus, your aims and objectives are. Okay. Taking this up a step, I did this a few times with some very strong classes. You can find 3 versions of the same story. Okay, so from different publications, but the same story. We didn't quite manage it in what we're going to show you, but nearly. So cut those up into paragraphs, all of them. Place all the paragraphs from the 3 different versions of the same story on each table, on each Padlet. So first, they have to really look carefully at different aspects of the paragraphs from each publication to try and group those together, then justify those based in a global and a very local way. I think we'll look at ways to approach this in a second. Put the story back together in the correct order, and then again, give a summary, give an oral summary, give a written summary. They could do a radio spot, whatever you would like. So we'll take you through. We can't go through it in complete detail. We haven't got time, but we have taken 3 paragraphs from a story from The Guardian. Oh, firstly, another another big advantage of doing this with the media, I think, is you can find a lot of very different approaches to using language and very different opinions on the same story. We have gone with the tried and tested, very traditional, very safe topic of, Victoria?
The environment.
The environment. It doesn't offend anybody, it's nice and clear. So here we have a story taken from The Guardian, or 3 paragraphs taken from The Guardian. I took this straight off the internet yesterday, okay? So 3 paragraphs here about rainforest loss, okay? This is from The Guardian. And then the same story from the BBC. We've got 4 paragraphs there. And then it's not exactly the same story, but a similar sort of topic area from The Sun, which is a British tabloid. Okay. So how could we start with this, Victoria? What would be the first stage, do you think?
Yeah, maybe considering style.
Yeah.
The style they are written.
So again, the first time you're doing it, give them the support for this, okay? So focus on style, syntax, and what do we notice about the 3 Guardian paragraphs, Victoria?
That the complexity in terms of syntax is quite high because there are different subordinate clauses inside the same paragraph.
Exactly. In each of the paragraphs, we have found this. So subordinate clauses, basically giving additional unbiased extra information. Okay, the last one is slightly more complex. So Rod Taylor said this was only a partial picture. So we're quite complex sentences here. And as we said, only really providing additional, quite complex, but additional information to what has already been stated. If we move on to the BBC. Oh, sorry, there it is in its entirety. So we can see that structural syntactic commonality across the 3 paragraphs from this article. Okay. BBC, Victoria, what's the difference here?
Yeah, we see that sentences are shorter than in the previous example, and also the paragraphs are shorter. And in terms of structure, it is more simple. It is simpler and also more accessible for readers as a result.
Exactly. All of these are fairly simple sentences compared to what we saw in The Guardian. Quite short. We do have a little bit more. We have a little bit of punctuation, a little bit of more complexity. And then we move on to The Sun, the last option. What do we notice here, Victoria?
The sentences again are shorter, so again more accessible for readers, and then we will see a difference in terms of language. But I will say that
we'll look at that in a minute. Syntactically, these are all. I mean, 1, 2, 3. The first 3 sentences don't even have any punctuation. No, the first 4 sentences. So they are sentence-long paragraphs. They are informative, punchy. Not complex, not even any punctuation, as I said, nor in the last one. The 5th, the penultimate one, we do have a subordinate clause there, providing extra additional information, slightly less sort of, how could we say, unbiased additional information, but we'll look at that afterwards. So we've had a look at the style and the syntax, the commonalities across the different paragraphs here. We could also have a look at language and tone. So in The Guardian, Victoria, what did we highlight?
We highlighted that the use of adjectives is maybe more academic and sophisticated.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to offer unbiased information as well.
Yeah, pristine tropical rainforests, held significant stores of carbon, a vast array of wildlife. So this is, I mean, this would be accessible by a B2 plus student, I imagine, receptively speaking. Writing, it would be a high level. Receptively, I'd say this is strong B2. The unprecedented fires, a partial picture there. So again, language-wise, quite academic. quite academic language being used here.
Mm-hmm.
The BBC.
Yeah, the information seems to be more factual because there are fewer adjectives here.
Exactly, not very many adjectives. Again, we saw earlier that syntactically it's not that complex. The language, this would probably be accessible reading-wise to a strong B1 student, I imagine. It's quite simple, quite clear. And then moving on to the Sun. What do we notice here, Victoria? Quite a difference in language here.
Yeah, much more emphatic language with examples like drown out, drastic
consequences.
Yeah,
Work of 100 leading experts.
Yeah.
Obviously, exactly 100. It was shed trillions of tons in mass. I mean, even the subordinate clause, that's about 10% of the world's population. It's quite sensationalistic. So we can see language and tone-wise again what characterizes these paragraphs. So so giving your students this a structured way to approach this. Look for this in the different paragraphs. Exactly, Adriana, very emotional. And we are, again, well, once we've identified things between the paragraphs and put them together, we're working again on a global level with the text and on a very detailed look at the language and how language is used. Avoid which one? I don't know. No, not at all, Salvador. We chose these three specifically because something like The Guardian, do you remember at the beginning in that C1 can-do statement, it said serious newspapers? I don't know what serious newspapers mean. The Guardian is available for free online. It's a nice one, and the sort of the level, the complexity and the style and level of the language is probably a little higher, but it's very interesting to show students, especially at this level at C2, how differently language is used. And yes, Salvador, I mean, another great exercise, we'll talk about this later in the writing, a great exercise we were talking about with David actually is when you're focusing on writing, get your students to write detailed plans of the writing they will be doing. And then you can either be really horrible and get them to swap their plans, and they have to, exactly, Simone, thank you, swap their plans and write somebody else's one, or write that in 100 words. Not all sort of tabloid journalism, but some tabloid journalism, it's a very skilled technical writing. And yes, they use very emphatic, very sensationalistic language, but they can have the same effect as a long piece in another newspaper, using colloquial language, using very short, punchy sentences. So at this level, I would say using a combination of these is very useful, and showing your students how to achieve different purposes or the same purpose using language in very different ways, I think is useful. So we did choose the Sun intentionally to compare how they achieve these things in different ways. And if you just look at the introduction on each of those, they're wonderful. All of them use language in very different ways. They all achieve their aims, but very differently. And interestingly, I think, what was I looking at? Yeah, I looked at, on Read and Improve, if you just type in C2+, a lot of the material that it chooses is from what some people might consider less serious sources. Again, because especially in the more popular journalism writing, the use of colloquialisms, etc., is much broader. So at C2, like we said at the beginning, one of the most horrible can-do statements was can access any piece of writing, whether it's abstract, colloquial, literary, non-literary. So having exposure to this, I think, is very useful at these higher levels. Or read what David said. So yeah, just to finish, bear these 4 points in mind. I think is key to helping students at this level. Sorry if we focus a little more on C2, but all of this is applicable to C1. We did a dedicated webinar on C1 Advanced, which you can find on the website if you'd like more information on that. But we sometimes find there isn't enough material on C2, so we really wanted to try and provide some advice and some help, because, as we said, it is a big jump from C1 to C2. And we love just talking a lot about wait until the writing one, that's our favorite. Thank you all for coming. We'll just talk you through some more resources, etc. Well, Victoria will, whilst I give you access to all the files. So Victoria?
Okay. Yep. On our main website, you have a section supporting every teacher, and there you will find exam preparation material, also access to the Supporting Every Teacher blog. You will also be able to watch our free webinars, and of course also have access to free teaching resources. And in this case, I want to mention that there are lesson plans being made as we speak. We have been creating them for the last month or so, and the new ones are adapted, can be adapted to the online situation. So you can use them if you're teaching face-to-face, but you can also see how you can apply them if you're teaching online. And in this case, I think that most of the resources available are for C1. And not many for C2.
No, plenty for A2, B1, B2.
Yeah.
Fewer for C1, and I don't think there's anything ready for C2 yet. But please listen to some of or try some of the activities and the approaches that we mentioned. And as we said, a lot of material-wise, one of your biggest advantages with C2 is that you can
use a lot of authentic material.
As much authentic material as possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, we have the support pack, which is an interactive PDF where you can find everything, basically everything that is available. There are also tips for teaching mixed ability classes. So check it out, because it really has a lot, and it's been produced quite recently. And some more resources here for you to check, or some more links for you to have in case you want to have a look at them.
Excellent. I've given you all access now to the handouts, which has the Japan activity and what we showed you from The Guardian, the BBC, and The Sun. And you should have access to your certificates. Okay, it's a PDF, but it is an editable PDF. If you have problems, please email the email address that's available where you signed up. Friday we have writing at C1 and C2. Next week we have assessing reading and listening online, which we'll be looking at all levels for that, from A2 up to C1 probably. And then keep your eyes out. I think they'll be up on the website in the next couple of days. We'll be doing listening and speaking at C1 and C2, I think on the 17th and the 19th of June to complete this series. So yes, thank you. Thank all of you very much for coming and for staying for over an hour. Oh no, pretty much an hour on the nose.
An hour, yes.
Thank you all very much. No more questions. We will head off and hopefully see some of you, or all of you, or all of you and your colleagues who haven't come in today on Friday. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. And we'll speak to you soon. Gabrielle, listening is on the 17th of June. I think they will be going up on the Global Cambridge website by the end of this week or early next week. And Victoria passed C2 years ago. I'm not sure about my level. I have never tried C2. And somebody mentioned this earlier. I mean, it would be interesting to see how many natives actually passed it. It is a very challenging exam. But Victoria passed it years ago.
It was tough.
I'm sure it was. I remember teaching for it. It was really tough. And sometimes, you have those students who expect, you to sort of spill all of your knowledge, into the class and them to absorb it. But at this level, it takes a lot more than that. Thank you, Moises. Thank you. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a lovely second half of the week. We're over halfway now. So heading towards the weekend. See you on Friday. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.